June 27th, 2017, 2 a.m., Mackinac Island State Park. I used to be what one would use the term workaholic, with little if any free time to myself and my hobbies. I worked in the tech department of a big corporation based on operating out of Ann Arbor. This is where I'd be dedicating myself non-stop to back-breaking hours of sorting through code, beta testing, and other menial tasks for which I'm overqualified, but do nonetheless. I had finally reached a breaking point when I was rushed to a hospital after suddenly collapsing at work. This led me to be given some time off. Deciding that spending some time, or little time I had outdoors, would be the most productive way to counteract the effects of working long hours. I called up my brother and arranged for us to spend some time exploring Mackinac Island State Park. My brother was always the outdoorsy type back when we were growing up. He'd always lavished in an opportunity to explore and enjoy all the perks that nature had to offer. On one of his fine adventures in the great outdoors, he was introduced to this island by some friends of his. I couldn't hear the end of how great it was since. So, feeling that a retreat far away from the hustle and bustle of the big city would be grand for my recovery, I called my brother and asked him to introduce me to scenic wonders that the great outdoors had to offer. As expected, he was elated to hear that we finally had a chance to bond over the features that nature had to offer, and he could finally prove to me that camping and the outdoors were not a boys-only activity. He promised to fetch me on the weekend, so we could then spend an entire week exploring every nook and cranny of this island. He made the drive to my house, arriving at around 2 p.m. to pick me up for the 251-mile journey to Mackinac Island from Ann Arbor. After a couple of pit stops along the drive that afforded us some much-needed bond time, and some really delicious homemade pies at a variety of diners along the way, we finally made it to the island, right around midnight the same day. After entering the island via the bridge, we then had to abandon our vehicle as there was a ban on the use of cars on this island. This rule stemmed from a law that was passed down back in 1898. It was explained to us by one of the hotel receptionists where we stayed at for the night. We were exhausted from our long journey, but still anxious to explore all the natural wonders that the island had to offer. Especially any of its natural wonders rarely ever touched by man. However, these were far and few in between, as I would discover the following day, when to my dismay, the island turned out to be more of a resort than a holistic nature getaway. A disappointment I didn't spare saying to my brother, but something I should have seen in advance. To this, he proposed a solution of checking out an unexplored patch of wilderness on the island. He promised that although camping wasn't permitted on the island, he had been introduced to a spot where visitors can secretly have a true outdoor experience. He was shown the spot by a past guide as one of his previous stays here at the inn. He was also intent on proving that outdoor activities were a not male-only club, and seeing how a retreat into nature could do me well. I was intent on humoring him. We settled upon a rustic woodland area near the coast. It must have been more than 2 miles long, with some really large rock formations that helped ensure we did not get lost in all the foliage. We had been on the island for an entire day and a half at that point, and it was dawn on a Tuesday when my brother got us a spot to start a campfire in amongst all the trees. There was evidence we weren't the first to take this course of action, of course, with the cinders of what appeared to be a previous campfire in this area. Some that looked as though they were made and abandoned only a few days before we arrived. My brother got to making a campfire himself, and he managed to carry in some snacks with him, so he could make s'mores. Everything was going well, and I really did start to feel as though my spirit and physical health were getting a well-deserved boost. Not to mention that I rarely got to spend time with my brother, due to my work commitments. So, this time that we were having together was really nice. This was until nighttime began to kick in, around 7 p.m., when the rustling of wind in the background turned into what sounded like someone skulking in the bushes. At first, we thought that it might be someone from the island who had wandered into the forest, or maybe an employee of the island's hotels or stores. But after my brother called out in the direction of the noise, and no response, we assumed it was an animal. We could immediately tell that whatever was lurking in the bushes was very big, and from the trees that were shaking in the background, and the sounding of branches cracking as they were being walked over, my brother's calling out only seemed to entice the creature even more, as now the noise grew louder as the creature came closer to our campsite. We could start to make out its features from its silhouette in the dark. What my brother saw and I coming towards us made us so scared we could do nothing but react and stare in absolute fear. What we saw staring right at us was this huge bipedal dog-like creature that was so tall it stood equal in height to a smaller pine tree just behind it, maybe 7 or 7.5 feet tall. It stood on 2 legs, from what we saw, and remained standing the entire time. Its body, especially its torso, looked similar to that of a man, with a face that resembled a wolf. It had a short snout, and its mouth grimaced at us in a horrifying snarl as we watched drool. It stopped short of coming completely out of the dark and into the light shining off the fire as we looked in absolute terror. It was almost as if we were in a standoff, us staring at it, and it staring back at us. My brother mustered just enough courage to reach for a steel tong that we had used to cook the s'mores. And as soon as he did this thing took notice and quickly took off deep into the foliage. Despite its menacing appearance, it seemed more curious and talkative than anything else. We instinctively knew to immediately leave the campsite and head in a direction opposite of where we saw this creature. We haven't shared yet what we saw with anyone else, fearing they'd think we were on a drug binge or drinking spree in the woods. But we know what we saw, and although we've never talked about it to each other again, we both know that we have each other's back. It's been a few Novembers since this happened, but it's still terrifying all the same. Even typing it out, it still brings back really bad memories, but I feel it's an important story to share, and really disproves the notion, growing up, that monsters don't exist, because simply, what my friend and I saw that night is something straight out of a Stephen King novel. You have to understand that right before this happened, a very close family friend who I've been friends with for a very long time, and still am, her boyfriend of 6 years cheated on her, and then dumped her. Not only being emotionally distraught, but she was really needing company and did not want to be alone. Since I was free for the weekend and didn't have any plans, I offered to come stay at her place for the weekend. It would keep her mind occupied and keep her spirits good. I showed up and we had a little bit of a girls' night, watching movies, eating popcorn, just doing anything we could to keep her mind off her ex-boyfriend. Because of her not having the greatest finances in the world, she ended up with this little podunk place, kind of on the outskirts of town. A lot of woods around, but still very pretty on the outside. It wasn't like it was run down or anything, just very small. But it was just her living there, where her ex could and would occasionally visit her when they were together. So, what else more could you need? At about 11 or maybe midnight, my phone was down to about 9 or 10% battery, and I realized, oh crap, I left my charger and clothes in the car. So, I headed out to my car to retrieve all my stuff since I was staying the weekend. And that's right when I saw what looked to be, or appeared to be, a werewolf. I stepped out on her front porch, clicked the unlock button, and as soon as I was doing this in unison, the front porch light and my car lit up together at the same time, illuminating the entirety of the area, which, right before, as I clicked the button, before opening the door, was pitch black. As soon as both lights came on, I was screaming, totally startled by what I saw. Standing, maybe not even 6 feet behind my car, approaching the house, was this really tall, I hate to say it, cliche werewolf figure. Instantly, I felt like I was in slow motion, like my brain was scrambling to try and just make sense of what I was taking visually in. I was seeing it right in front of me. The most realistic werewolf costume I had ever seen in my life. But as it was moving, I could clearly see its defined muscles working under its skin, and the way it was breathing coming towards me. This was something straight out of a movie or a Stephen King novel, which, I would know, I've read a lot of his books growing up. I love him as an author. That's why the first thing I thought of when I saw this, believe it or not, is his book Silver Bullet, which is all about werewolves. I was now screaming, turned around, went back in the house, locking the door. Now, as I'm coming back in the house, fumbling with my keys, trying to lock the door, my friend, who's curious, but also now panicked, rushes to the window to see what's wrong. Then, she begins screaming as she starts asking me, "What is that thing?" She now sees it too. That's when she closes the blinds and we both run and dive into the kitchen, grab the largest knife she had, and sat there, huddled together, crying. Within a minute, we hear this thing walk like a man would on 2 legs to the very back door where her sliding glass door is. Luckily, that had blinds on it too. It was very aggressively trying to open the door, as if this animal knew what handles were. So that means this was either a person in a very convincing costume, or this was something else entirely. We were dealing with a real-life monster here. It was rattling the door so violently and so hard that maybe after 10 or 15 seconds, it gave up. Paced around the house a couple of more times, pounding on the windows, scratching on the house. Not heavily though, but I believe if it wanted to. This thing possessed the strength to shatter a window. But it was like it was trying to find a weak point into the house. Like it was strategizing and thinking. Trying to get one in at one point. It kept wiggling the door handle of the front door violently, as if hoping it would release. Luckily, it never did. We went through a period of time where we did not hear it at all, but still far too worried to get it from the kitchen floor. So, we decided to stay put, still crying, still scared, the only sound being the outside and the TV faintly going. About 12 minutes now goes by, and I do remember this because I was looking right at the clock on the oven, which was right next to where we were on the floor, perfectly visible. We heard a couple, very loudly distinctive pops. It sounded like something being blown up or a large balloon popping. 2 of them, actually, and then silence. We heard nothing. Eventually, my friend and I just fell asleep, huddled next to each other, knives still in our hands. I was the first to wake up. I jolted my friend awake, telling her, "We made it. It's morning. The light's out." It was now maybe about 7:45, maybe 8 a.m. at this point, and it's almost winter. So the sun is kind of late on rising, especially here up north. My phone was now dead, and because I had an Android, she had an iPhone. I had no choice but to go and grab my charger from the car. I was going to figure something out and just thinking I cannot let my friend stay here. She didn't have a car at the time, and she mainly got rides back and forth. As I went out to my car, I realized something horrifying. Even though the sun was up, and I was now no longer afraid to go into the darkness, the two back tires of my Prius were completely flat. I walked over to check them out. It looked as if somebody had slashed them, but upon looking closer, I realized that something large had actually bit into them, popping them with its teeth. There were these huge puncture holes in both the back tires. I mean, these tires weren't just a little flat. They were completely flat. And I had already used my spare and never bothered to replace it about a year or two ago before this. To make a long story short, I ended up calling a tow truck. I had the guy give me his personal opinion on what he thought happened. He told me, "Sweetheart, you either have a very aggressive bear that bit these tires, or you ran over some spikes. But something happened here." Anyway, I took my friend with me back to my place where she would stay for 2 more weeks before returning back to her house, only for a couple of days before going to stay with her family for a couple of months, then permanently moving there. She eventually went back to town, but only for a day to collect her belongings, never staying overnight. Whatever happened that night, we don't talk about it. I wish I knew more about what it is that we saw, this woolly, hairy, shaggy, wolf-looking thing, but unfortunately, I'm not a biologist. Thank you for taking the time to read this encounter. I hope, if anything, it's provided at least some entertainment, even if it's been at my expense. Even if it has been at my friend's expense as well. Thank you. March 6th, 2010, 7 p.m. Corvallis, Oregon. I hail from a family of renowned hunters. My siblings and I grew up listening to my father's tales of exotic hunts in Africa. The time our great-grandfather fought off a large grizzly bear with nothing but a hunting knife. So, it's no surprise that I developed a knack for the hunt at a very early age. And I know that a female interested in hunting might seem unusual to some people. In Oregon, it's a lot more common than you might think. Whenever I did go hunting, it'd always be in the company of either my older brother or father, who learned the tricks of the trade from his father, who, in turn, learned what he knew about hunting from his father before him, and so on. It wasn't that I couldn't exactly hunt on my own, or that I needed help to do the heavy lifting. But, having been on what must have been hundreds of outings by now into the great outdoors, you soon come to learn that animals aren't the only thing to be on the lookout for in the wild. And having company is a good way to be safe of any dangers that may lurk in the woods. I was always going on about hunting in the outdoors to several of my friends. One of them, who was studying forestry at the Oregon State University. They told me specifically about a hunting and forestry trail in this here area, and she told me it was well worth checking out. It was in the Corvallis area, and it belonged to a sustainable logging company. The company was even nice enough to offer free permits to anybody who wanted to hunt and hike on their land. They also gave lectures at the College of Forestry at Oregon State, and this gave my friend access to the permits rather easily. But, most importantly, access on the weekends, which was the quietest time to explore their property, without having to worry about other hunters and hikers getting in your way. Since the permit belonged to my friend, and I always took my older brother with me on my hunts, we all made reservations to explore the lands on the upcoming Saturday in March of 2010. When the day finally came, I could barely contain my excitement, which was only heightened by the fact that we weren't technically permitted to hunt in March. However, if we got caught, my friend claimed to know the perfect spot to catch deer that was far away from any logging activities and free from the prying eyes of any law enforcement. Not knowing her to be someone who'd make something up like that, we took her on her word very seriously and arrived at Starker Forest early in the morning. The sheer size of the land and forest within was truly astonishing. Some areas were dense evergreen forests, while others were reserved for logging. Still, other areas were open spaces with thick stumps in the spots where once mighty trees stood. The majority of the forest was quiet, and the only people we encountered were loggers on the job and park rangers sometimes doing their rounds. Since visitors weren't technically permitted to explore on weekends, my friend's student card served as a very handy tool to stop any suspicion our presence brought up. Also, our bags were big enough to conceal the one Montana X3 rifle that we had successfully managed to hide for hunting deer. Dawn had come and gone with us, heading deeper into the forest, far away from any logging and rangers, and it began to seem as though that we were lost, even though my friend insisted she'd taken the route before. That's when we started to find strange things, and started experiencing an overwhelming feeling that something sinister was stalking and watching us at a distance. It started with some brush that looked like it was broken and pushed aside by a very large animal. Definitely not a deer or elk. Then, we found a deer carcass, or what was left of it. Just a head and spine, and were so fresh, you could still see red in the meat. At this point, my brother had the rifle drawn and ready. And just then, our feelings of unease slowly turned into terror as the sound of footsteps became louder and louder and louder. From the sounds of whatever was making them was now only 20 feet away from us, and closing the distance very fast. My brother promptly responded by firing in the direction of the noise, which caused whatever this was to scream out violently and became more erratic with its steps, but not slow down. Now it began to run in our direction, bipedally, and we can now see this creature that was behind all of this commotion. A huge gaunt figure emerging from the bushes, running straight toward us. Had I not been in the woods with two other people, I would have thought that I was seeing things. Slowly, the creature came into my line of sight. I was shocked to see that a giant wolf was running on its hind legs, just like a human was. Its head was that of a typical wolf, but its body was more like that of a distorted person, similar to what you see in werewolf movies. It howled in agony, nearly tumbling down as it charged toward us, with its howl almost sounding like the muffled, horrified, distorted screams of a man. While my friend and I paused in fear, my brother quickly reacted, firing off another round from his rifle. This caused this animal, creature, thing, whatever you want to call it, to veer off course and run for cover into the trees in the thicket opposite of us. Although he missed this time, it did seem to scare it away. I was scared and not really sure what to do, but managed to check the time, seeing that it was 7 p.m. We instantly all agreed that it would be wise if we now left the area immediately, before this thing decided to come back and try its luck a second time. Or worse, bring friends. We were intercepted by two rangers as we made a run for what we hoped was the exit. And although hunting season is a punishable offense, at least in the off-season, after seeing how shaken up we were just escorted to the property gate, with only a warning. "Must be karma, you all running into a predator out here," the one ranger remarked. "What was it?" We all looked at each other for a split second, and I said this: "Just a bear. We came across a bear." I knew that none of us would want to open that can of worms by telling them what we really saw out there. Thank you for hearing my encounter. I've been a farmer for almost a decade now. I inherited a small patch of land from my parents that's roughly an hour to an hour and a half drive from St. Louis, Missouri. I hail from one of the first families to settle down in the entirety of the Missouri area, and the land that I decided to call home and establish my roots here. It's been in our family for generations. It was a scenic outcrop of evergreen pastures that went on for miles in every direction. There was a rather large river on one end, not too far from the farmhouse, that provided water to my crops and livestock. And east of my property was a deep forest that was so big it went on to form part of the Mark Twain National Forest. It was this forest, as well as the occasional pest outbreaks and the drop in price of livestock, that were my biggest headache on the farm. Although the forest wasn't an official border to my farm because, technically, I owned a large part of it, I would soon come to learn that it was best if I treated it as an official border for the east end of my property, and basically never passed that border. I'll get into that here shortly, and you'll understand why. My farm is based in a pretty remote area that is ways off from any human activity. Actually, that was one of its biggest selling points to me, and one of the reasons why nobody else in the family had wanted it. In a way, I think my parents knew I'd appreciate the solitude and off-the-grid lifestyle it would provide me, which is why they chose me to leave it to in the first place. You had to drive through a maze of dirt roads just to make it to the nearest road, and I honestly liked it that way. But 4 years into owning the land, I began to lose the occasional sheep to various wildlife that would venture out of the forest in search of food. This almost always happened at night when I was fast asleep. I never did witness what would kill my sheep directly, but I'd find tracks near the site of the kill that gave me a rather good idea of what it was. And with the tracks always being canine-like, I knew the local woods harbored some wolf packs. We even had a bear show up on the property at one point. Although it didn't cause any harm to the livestock, it seemed to be interested in looking around. I had seen it coming from a distance and was safely watching it from my kitchen window. But, finally, it got bored and left, some 2 hours later. Since livestock farming was one of the main ways I made an income, the predators that ventured out of the forest onto my farm prompted me to build a secure enclosure for my sheep. And I also got a sheepdog to keep them safe when they were out grazing. After constructing a proper enclosure for my sheep and getting a sheepdog to keep an eye on them, the casualties all but stopped. Not the occasional forest animal didn't come wandering in every now and then, though. Now, I know I just said that the casualties all stopped, but let me just say that was only until April of 2012. This was around the time my sheepdog, named Jack, began to get really worked up come dawn every day. I would bring him inside with me after we had directed the sheep back into the enclosure around 5 p.m. daily. But for some strange reason, he'd go crazy, barking frantically towards the direction of the sheep's enclosure at nighttime. Having worked with animals even before I ever moved to the farm, I knew that my dog's panic was nothing to take light of. And one Thursday, he was so frantic that he even began hurling himself against the door. Also, the sheep were bleating so loud I could hear them from inside the house. All of this prompted me to go and investigate what was really happening. So, it was around 10 p.m., and I reached for my shotgun, heading towards the sheep's enclosure. Jack runs ahead of me, and seemed to stop at a distance, growing ever more frantic. Little did I know, we were both about to encounter the most terrifying night of our lives. As I caught up to, and I came closer, a 7-foot silhouette greeted me, and what I saw was so ghastly and shocking that I froze in my tracks. Jack wasn't doing any better, and kept a safe distance from the creature, and barked at it like I've never heard him bark before. The creature's shape resembled something you'd expect to see in a Bram Stoker novel, and had I not been so close to it as I was, I probably would have thought it was a very large bear. It had a face no different from one of the timber wolves that came into the farm. But that was about as far as similarities go. Its body, especially its torso, resembled that of a man. It had long human-like arms that almost went as far down to its ankles, with hominid-like hands that ended in extremely large claws. Its face stared at us in grimace, and I couldn't tell if it was about to lunge at us or if it was making sure we did not come any closer. Just for the record, I had no intention of doing that. Its lower body, though, was more wolf-like. But what stood out the most is its bipedal gait. And the way it stood, it never deviated. Not even once during our encounter, which made me realize that it must always use 2 legs and not 4. I couldn't look away from it as it faced off with my dog, who was going absolutely berserk. The creature responded by making a blood-curdling sound that sounded more like a man moaning or crying or screaming. It's hard to say which. More human than any sound that a canine would ever produce. It stood there in a territorial standoff with my dog, neither one moving an inch, until eventually, Jack mustered up enough courage to advance toward it, calling its bluff and sending the creature bolting towards the woods. I couldn't believe he did that. Soon after, this creature ran off. I grabbed my phone and I called 911. Jack and I stood frozen in place and didn't even think to withdraw ourselves back to the house. We literally couldn't think. I waited for the cops from the nearest town to arrive. The pain of living rural. They came about an hour after the incident, so around 11 p.m. And they confirmed the encounter did happen, but they could not confirm what species of animal did it. They were able to confirm because they found a dead animal just outside the enclosure, and around it was a strange set of tracks. The tracks headed off into the woods exactly where we watched it run. I heard one officer whispering to another that these tracks looked strange since they were too big to be a wolf, and I also heard him say that it appeared that this creature walked off on 2 legs instead of 4. I didn't sleep that night, and I haven't slept well since. Every time my dog barks in the early dawn hours, I think of this horrific encounter. It's definitely a trigger that brings me right back to that day. Unfortunately, it happens way more than I'd like it to, and I'm hoping that one day I'll get past it all. But for now, I'm just doing the best I can. Thanks for listening. I always loved Januaries, ever since I was a small child. It was one of the only times I ever got to spend with my father, who was away from home most of the year. He worked in the oil drilling operations in Alaska's North Slopes, which meant that I only got to see him for very short intervals all throughout the year, except for his yearly time off from mid-December all the way through February. I was extremely close with my father, and despite being a girl, we both shared a passion and love for the outdoors, especially fishing. In fact, most of his time off was spent in search of the ultimate fishing spot. He always looked for one that had an equal balance of sights to look at and fish to catch. During his break in 2009, he found a great fishing spot here in Alaska, which he claimed was as vast, if not bigger, than the town we were from. He said that the river split out into various channels over an area of land that stretched out for hundreds of miles. My mind was racing just thinking of all the different species of fish that such a large stretch of river would even possess. And now, I felt that all of our previous outings and fishing trips would pale in comparison to this one trip, for more reasons than just the fishing. It was also the first time that we would be going to Alaska for one of our fishing trips, and this trip, which was to the Kobuk River, gave us the perfect chance to learn about a new wilderness spot. Even the drive to Alaska was scattered with awe-inspiring scenery. My father took the most scenic routes as he confined any mind wandered as I watched the majestic foothills and beautiful landscapes out the window. We had left our house with enough provisions for a whole week, and also brought along our trusted kayak to enhance the fishing experience. Plus, it's always good to be familiar with their boat in order to have the best experience. We planned to follow the route taken by some of the Kobuk's earlier settlers, and the brochures we had with us promised a lot of fishing camps, hunting spots along the way. There was even the chance of finding an object of archaeological importance as we passed through the lesser used paths. The area was very difficult to reach at first, and I'm sure my father must have wished that we had come from a larger fishing party than just me. I was still young and really too small to be of any real assistance. We were saved when, along the way, we made it to the village of Ambler, where my father was able to leave behind our small kayak and rent a good-sized raft that we would use from that point onwards from our journey. A guide had warned us to be wary of the rapids and even gave us a map so we can know where we were approaching them. He also gave us a very stern warning to look out for bears for entering our campsite at night, even though they were the target of hunts and usually avoided humans. You could never be sure. I also got the feeling he wanted to warn us to be on the lookout for something else, but held himself back at the very last minute. Little did I know then that he would soon get a good idea of what he was thinking of. We saw many sights along the way and came across several other hunting parties on the shore, setting up their camps, of course. Light aircraft could be seen flying overhead, bringing people into the rivers, and we saw other rafting groups with people fishing. We arrived at Ambler on Friday and had spent a whole 3 days afloat along the many sub-rivers and tributaries of the Kobuk River, when we spotted on the shoreline an area of open land with no hunting parties or any fishing companies on it. It was now midday, right around 3 p.m. It looked to be the perfect place to start a small fire and cook ourselves some lunch. The journey to this spot had been a tumultuous one, with currents that had taken us a good distance from the shore. But just as my father rowed the raft towards the shore to land it, a large caribou came running at a great speed from out of the dense forest, just a couple of feet from the shore. It stops, paused at the foot of the river, just in front of us. But as the trees kind of rattled behind it, it quickly plunged itself into the ice-cold waters and started swimming straight towards our raft. We all look at each other, both thinking that we were watching something incredible, and wondering what else was about to happen or come out of the forest. Now, besides the caribou, we were both curious to see what predator or hunter was chasing it and making it so scared as it starts to swim towards us. My father whispered that he was worried that it could either be a bear or maybe a hunter just indiscriminately firing in our direction, that he might be off in the trees. But neither showed up to the shore. Instead, to our horror, this massive wolf-like creature that was on 2 legs reared its grotesque face from the thick forest. As it entered the open land, it briefly stopped to search its surroundings, and it quickly spotted a caribou in the water. It made a blood-curdling howl that sounded like no animal I had ever heard before, almost having a human-like quality to it. The caribou's eyes were wide with fear, and we worried about where it might be heading, since it continued to head deeper into the water. The wolf creature then quickly ran towards the shore, only pausing as the water brushed up against its strangely shaped legs, howling as if in frustration that it could not reach this caribou, which was clearly its prey because its long teeth hanging from its mouth, eager to bite into this thing. The wolf creature quickly ran towards the shore, only pausing as the water brushed up against it. We pushed ourselves deeper into the body of the river, hoping to catch a current to take us out of the area. We threw a quick glance over at the caribou, and it seemed to be thinking the same thing. The wolf dog creature was now starting to go into the water as well, and with a bit of quick thinking, I threw some of the fish we'd caught in its direction, hoping to catch its attention, maybe distract it. Luckily, this seemed to work. We were finally able to catch a current, and as we drifted away from this wolf-man hybrid creature, it stopped its chase when one of the fish swam near it. We stayed drifting in a raft for hours until we came upon a large hunting party on the shores. We must have looked like a wreck as they happily invited us in amongst them. We were visibly shaken from the whole ordeal and explained what had happened. One member told us we had just been privy to the legendary Dogman of Alaska, a dog-human hybrid that is supposedly said to roam the areas of this river, the areas most men don't dare go. He claimed it was good fortune to see it, but knowing how close we came to being face to face with this creature, with this predatory, calculating look in its eyes, we felt anything but lucky. For as long as I can remember, I have been a staunch supporter of the law. I had a strict upbringing and wasn't the type of person who allows for ambiguities, the kind that lay between the good and bad in society. It is probably no surprise to you then that I ended up in law enforcement, or at least an offshoot of it. I and a small team of others were the patrolmen of a local patch of woods that lay on the outskirts of Payson, Arizona. It wasn't my first choice of employment, I'll tell you that much, but it's a job that grew on me. And to be honest, I can't see myself doing anything else. I know it's a world away from inner city patrols, but if you've been on the job here long enough, you'll come to see things that no patrols in the city can provide you with. Every now and then, we would encounter something more than just your average trespassing teenagers, hanging out in the woods, smoking weed, having sex, or illegal loggers looking to make a quick buck. Sometimes, you'd even stumble across a bear, or mountain lion, or even a scene that you'd only see on the National Geographic. Sometimes, you'd encounter something so extraordinary, there is no real-world reference to match it. This is what happened to me and my colleague during one of our routine assignments into the Tonto National Forest here in Arizona. The weeks leading up to the encounter were eventful, to say the least, with two colleagues of mine finding the site of illegal logging on one of each of their patrols. What was strange about it, though, was that the site had been abandoned before they found it, and before the loggers could complete their activities. Their campsite was still in pristine condition with two tents. Each had sleeping bags inside and provisions still inside of them. Outside lay the remains of a campfire with a fresh pot that assumingly held boiling water, until the fire went out. There was even a chainsaw and an axe near at least half a dozen logs. A couple of feet from the campsite were also tire tracks, whose skid marks seemed to indicate that the vehicle had left in a hurry. The only thing we figured out that could have caused these loggers to flee and leave everything behind in such a hurry was a predator or group of predators showing up at the campsite unexpectedly. Although, predators in the forest weren't something new. Predators this close to the edge of the forest were concerning, since this is where most of the hiking trails and visitors took place. So, naturally, this put us all on high alert, looking out for anything unusual during our patrols. We honestly had no clue what the predators might be, but I had come across large droppings that did not match any of the local predators known to live in the forest. We made sure to pass the loggers' campsite at least once during our patrol rounds to see if they'd try to come back and collect their gear, but we never saw any sign of them. We had 4 teams of 2 people to patrol the park all throughout the year, with 2 teams patrolling that park in a week. But none of my fellow rangers had managed to even catch even a glimpse of these predators. That was until my partner and I went on a patrol. It was April 9th, a day like any other for me and my partner as we did our daily rounds. We had a patrol vehicle that we used in the areas of the forest that we could. But most of our day patrolling was spent on paths inaccessible by vehicles. Besides the occasional litter bug and hiker veering too far off the path, the day was turning out to be just like any other, until we encountered a group of young hikers scared half to death and mumbling on about werewolves or something, over to the east of where they came from. There were 3 of them, and they all reeked of weed. So we promptly sent them off in the direction and exited, and chalked their claims of werewolves down to a wolf sighting, exuberated by their choice of recreation. For the first time in weeks, we had hopes of finally catching the predators that had been terrorizing our park's visitors, especially now that we had just heard this account of wolves. As soon as we could identify the predator's location, we would be able to figure out a way to deal with them. So we headed east, in the direction the hikers had come. It was around 7 p.m. and the night was coming. This, coupled with the trees, was making it hard to see anything in the forest, but we always had a flashlight on us. That was standard procedure, so we clicked in on it and used it. My partner held the flashlight and shined it ahead of us on the path, so I walked ahead following its light, when suddenly, in the shadows in front of me, just beyond the reach of the flashlight, I caught a glimpse of a wolf munching something. I guess it was food that the hikers left behind, but in this case, the wolf was 3 times the size of any wolf I had seen. As soon as the light hit the line of sight, it paused and raised itself up, slowly turning towards them. This is where things get weird, as its body was disproportionately positioned for a wolf. Instead, it almost resembled the body of a man. This creature was frantic. You could tell that it didn't think it would be seen, and you could see its eyes that it seemed smart. The closer they got, the more territorial it became, growling as though it thought they were able to take its meal or something. It stared at us with piercing, glowing eyes that shined out from a head full of dark fur, matted fur that definitely showed us this creature had been living out here for a while. While I stood there, frozen and hesitating to go any further, my partner quickly drew her service pistol, firing a shot into the air. The sound was deafening, and you could tell that, whatever this creature was, it was bothered, disorientating it, making it angry. Then, she fired off a second shot that sent it running away, kind of angrily. We searched the area afterwards for signs of more dog creatures, secretly hoping we wouldn't find anything. But, indeed, we found several other prints. So, we're not really sure. Similar, but smaller ones than belonging to the creature that we saw. However, as for the creatures themselves, we found nothing. When it came time for an official report on the incident, that we filled out all the paperwork exactly as we experienced it, except for one critical point. We left out calling it a Dogman for obvious reasons, replacing the words with wolves. We knew that our jobs would have been in jeopardy, and maybe even our sanity questioned. We just felt it best to not shake anything up. Nothing, meaning no creature with this description, was ever seen again by us or the other patrols unless they also saw it, but chose to keep this story to themselves, just like us. However, to date, every now and then, hikers and hunters would venture too deep into the woods, and we'd often hear stories about them rushing out with terror in their eyes, screaming and yelling that they'd seen this creature. Some of them even reported it exactly as it sounded, like a Dogman. My now patrol partner and I never told anybody that we actually believed them. We just went through the motions and followed all of our training, telling them that what they had seen was perfectly normal and natural in the woods, and that in their surprise, their minds made it out to be more than it was. We knew they were in their right to be scared, but we still kept our encounter and our secret to ourselves. It was late March 2007 when I saw it. You probably wouldn't believe me if I told you. It's just that. I've got to share it with somebody. Anybody. I figured maybe if more people knew about it, well, maybe someday, There might be some real answers. That's gotta count for something. It might one day even save some lives. I mean, who knows? Maybe they'll collect each other's encounters. Anyway, here it goes. I was just a kid when this happened. We were in the middle of soccer practice. It was a late, sunny afternoon, but nothing too blinding. This was back when I was still dreaming of going to Berkeley. One of my teammates kicked the ball really hard. I started forward, but the ball sailed straight over my head, out of the soccer park, and across the street into a cluster of tightly woven trees. It was weird that it would land there because most of the land around the park was grassy and open, but I dismissed it and glanced from side to side, in case of any incoming traffic. The streets surrounding the park were usually overbusy, but I watched as one car, a common sedan in navy blue, passed by me. Everybody was impatient for me to get the ball, but I shrugged it off and crossed the street. I could see the mountains to my right, and as I jogged across the hot pavement, that's when I saw it. My teammates were much too far away to see anything. Right behind the ball, something was moving. Something big. I honestly thought it was a stray dog at first. I mean, anybody would if they'd seen it too. The dark, fluffy head of a rust-colored fur could easily belong to a Malamute, or even a long-haired German Shepherd. It could have even been a cross of the two, I suppose. I watched as the canine's nose wrinkled up and down, taking in each of the scents of the soccer ball. I watched in fascination and terror as it continued to lean closer. Since I like dogs, I stupidly called over to it, thinking it was maybe friendly. The thing, and I say thing because I realized shortly it was not a dog, glanced up at me and began to stand on its hind legs. I remember the impossibly long shadow as it fell over me. This thing, or dog, or whatever you want to call it, must have easily been twice my size. Whatever its true height was, I was scared, and I'm not exactly the type that scares easily. Yet in that moment, I could feel the blood drain from my skin as this dreaded creature stared me down with its soul-piercing gaze. The yellow eyes were like burning embers of something almost human staring straight through me, like it was judging or not whether to let me go. I couldn't pry myself away, and its gaze was absolutely mesmerizing. There was a dangerous sort of intelligence reflecting back from deep within its eyes, something far older and much more mysterious than its furry predecessors. I stayed where I was for what seemed like a long time. There really wasn't anywhere else I can go, to be honest. I wasn't sure how fast this thing could run, but I was willing to bet that it was a lot faster than me, and I was in good shape. But with legs like that, there was no way I would even stand a chance. His stride had to have been more than likely 2 or 3 times wider than mine. I could imagine him closing the gap between us in a mere heartbeat. This creature let out a low guttural growl. It rumbled out in a curious warning, but didn't sound anything like a dog should have sounded. It was almost like there were 2 different vocal cords. Whatever it was definitely did not hit like me. That was fine with me. I didn't like it much either, even if it was a him. I couldn't tell because there was a shadow between it. I bravely reached out with my trembling arm and grabbed the ball, using one of its massive clawed paws with nails that could have easily rivaled that of Confucius in length. If Confucius had ever been a dog-like beast, the creature suddenly swung back in the woods. I quickly grabbed the ball and made a dash for it. As I moved, this thing was making a trembling noise in the woods, smashing around the trees and kind of emitting a low growl. To my great surprise, it seemed to disappear very shortly. I was terrified beyond my wits, and I scanned the horizon for any sign of life, but there was none. My teammates back over were shouting loudly, yet I paid no attention to them. I was astonished at what I'd seen. Eventually, I gave up on the hope that I might one day see this thing again. Whatever it was, long gone. I hurried and took the soccer ball back to my teammates, where I then shared my story with them. They all thought I was nuts. I kind of thought I had lost it there too for a moment. And I never did see that thing again, though I went back many times to the same field. Maybe it was just passing through. Anyway, after that, I believe anything's possible. Though I think the real question is, what do you think? What animal did I see? Last July, I went camping with some friends. Sam and Evan, I'd actually seen recently. But Elizabeth was coming too, and I hadn't seen her since she moved to Alaska. I was excited to see everybody and just hang out by the tent with some beer and cook some good food on the fire. Sure enough, as soon as we got there and set up tent, cracked open the beer and started playing drinking games. First, we played King's Cup, and then Never Have I Ever. You know, the basics. As it got darker, we turned on an old lantern that Evan had brought. We only really had the light of the lantern, the stars, the fire, and the full moon, and occasionally our phones, lighting us up as we laughed and drank and hung out. Then, as the moon began to come out, we began hearing a faint howling noise. Off in the distance, we couldn't make out what it was. Well, I'll admit, I was definitely a bit scared. Being a city boy who's never seen a wolf in person, I was intrigued enough, or maybe I should say tipsy enough. It was hard to hide my excitement, though, at hearing real nature howls. I thought it would be funny. I tried to howl back, but my friend stopped me. Living in Alaska these past few months, she was much more in tune with the dangers of wildlife in a way I didn't know as a city boy, and somebody whose only interactions with nature were through things like National Geographic. Maybe because they were intrigued also, or maybe just to mess with Elizabeth, Sam and Evan joined in on the howling too, and soon I followed suit. Eventually, we began getting sleepy and ran out of ideas for drinking games, so we decided to crash. Sam and Evan were now staying in one tent, and Elizabeth and I were staying in another. Nothing was happening between us, it's just the way the sleeping arrangement worked out. I gave her privacy while she changed, and I felt the urge to go and use the bathroom. I was going to go use the public bathroom in the middle of the campground. You know, the kind with spider webs the size of your head in every corner, and dirt all over the sink, which makes you wonder if you're even dirtier after washing your hands. It was for that very reason, as well as the beautiful night, that I decided instead to go over by the river. The moonlight reminded me of a painting, and I chuckled to myself, imagining Bob Ross painting happy little trees along the mountain. I unzipped, went about my business, and enjoyed the fresh, cool evening air on my face, cooling me down from that flush of alcohol. I'm about to finish up when I see movement on the other side of the river. I squint my eyes to see a little bit more clearly, thinking it's probably a deer or something, and hoping it was just a moose since I've always wanted to see one but never had the chance. Well, whatever it was definitely big enough to be a moose. As the figure comes close to the bank of the river, I noticed it definitely wasn't a moose. For a second, I thought it was a doe or a big dog until I realized it was neither of those. It was a giant wolf, and when I say giant, I mean absolutely monstrous. I was definitely freaking out a little bit, but I think I had enough alcohol in me that the fear was muted and the curiosity was heightened. I stepped closer to the river, trying to get an even better look at the thing. It was occasionally glancing over at me, but it was mainly just standing there. I took one more step closer, and boom! I slipped on a mossy rock, landing right on my butt. I get up and see that this wolf is now staring right at me. I'm not sure if I scared it, or if it was just curious, but then that's when it happened. The wolf, what I thought was a giant gray wolf, then stood up on its hind legs. My first thought was that maybe it was doing what my cat does when she wants a treat or she's curious. which is to stand up on their hind legs to get a better look. But upon regaining my composure and looking closely at what I thought was a wolf, now fully illuminated by the moonlight, I realized it wasn't just balancing itself on its hind paws. It wasn't just propped up to get a better view. It didn't have paws. It had feet. Feet with large claws coming out of them. And it didn't have front paws either, but what appeared to be raccoon-like human hands. And they also had claws. And it had the face of a giant wolf, and it was now snarling at me. And that's when the scariest thing ever happened in my life. This creature, which after the extensive Googling once I got home that I'm sure was a Dogman, took a step towards me bipedally, on two legs like a man. And then another, and another, and another. Deliberate, well-balanced steps like it was used to walking on two legs normally. Steps that any animal should not be used to. I was terrified, frozen with fear. Every nerve in my body was on fire, screaming at me to get out of there. Every step this thing took sent me deeper and deeper into this fear-driven paralysis. My heart was now beating so hard it was like thunder, and I'm sweating bullets. I'm sure this thing was going to do God knows what. Eat me, maul me, tear me in pieces. And then luckily, it looked up, kind of looked around, and then looked off to the left, as if it knew something. Looked back at me and disappeared back into the tree line. For a moment, I stayed there, nearly hyperventilating, just trying to breathe deeply to stop my heart from collapsing in on itself. And after a few minutes, I got the shakes, but luckily, I was able to regain movement, and I now slowly backed away from the river, got into my tent, where my friend Elizabeth was out cold. Surprisingly, I somehow managed to sleep. It was a pretty restless sleep, of course, and I was in such shock that I forgot to change my pants. The next day, I told my friends what I saw, but they all just laughed at me and told me, "Yeah, dude, you were too drunk. You need to lay down." But I know what I saw. I haven't been hiking since because if creatures like that live out in the mountains, I'd rather stay away. But I've been reading up on Dogman, and everything people talk about rings true with my own experience. I never believed in so-called cryptids before, but ever since I went camping with my friends that day, I'm now a believer.